The autumn wind of 1719 carried the scent of salt and decay through the cobblestone streets of Charleston, where prosperity bloomed like magnolias over graves. The harbor bustled with merchant ships, their hulls heavy with human cargo from the Guinea Coast, while well-dressed colonists conducted their business with the casual indifference of those who had never known chains. Joanna pressed her face against the cold iron bars of the slave quarters window, watching the Whitmore mansion's servants prepare for the Thanksgiving feast. At 17, her dark eyes held depths that spoke of horrors no child should witness. 3 years had passed since the slave ship Prosperity had torn her from her homeland, yet the memory of her mother's screams still echoed in her dreams. "Get away from that window, girl," barked Overseer Thompson, his leather whip coiled at his side like a sleeping serpent. "Mrs. Whitmore wants you in the kitchen, and if I catch you daydreaming again—" Joanna lowered her gaze, her calloused hands smoothing the rough fabric of her worn dress. She had learned the language of survival in this place: silence, submission, and the careful art of hiding the fire that burned within her chest. The Whitmore kitchen was a symphony of chaos. Steam rose from enormous pots while servants rushed between preparation tables laden with turkey, sweet potatoes, and cornbread. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the center of it all, her silk dress pristine despite the surrounding mayhem, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Joanna, where have you been, you lazy creature?" Eleanor's pale blue eyes fixed on her with the cold intensity of a predator. "The silver needs polishing, and if I see even a fingerprint on my grandmother's candlesticks, you'll spend the night in the root cellar." "Yes, ma'am," Joanna whispered, her voice barely audible above the kitchen's din. Eleanor stepped closer, her perfume mixing sickeningly with the smell of roasting meat. "Look at me when I speak to you." Her gloved hand shot out, gripping Joanna's chin with painful force. "You people need to learn respect. My husband paid good money for you, and I expect a return on that investment." Joanna's eyes met Eleanor's, and for a moment something dangerous flickered between them. Eleanor's grip tightened, her nails digging into Joanna's skin. "That's better. Now get to work, and remember, I'll be watching." As Eleanor swept away, her heels clicking against the wooden floor, Joanna touched her chin where red marks were already forming. Around her, the other servants continued their work, their eyes carefully averted. They had all learned the same lesson. In the Whitmore house, survival meant invisibility. The silver service gleamed on the dining room table, reflecting the warm glow of dozens of candles. Joanna worked methodically, her movements precise despite the trembling in her hands. Through the tall windows, she could see Charleston's elite arriving in their carriages, their laughter carrying on the evening air like the sound of breaking glass. "Magnificent work, as always," came a voice behind her. Joanna turned to see Master Richard Whitmore, his round face flushed with wine and satisfaction. Unlike his wife's cold cruelty, Richard's attention carried a different kind of threat, one that made Joanna's skin crawl. "Thank you, sir," she managed, stepping back as he moved closer. "You know, Joanna, you're quite beautiful for your kind." His hand reached toward her face, but the sound of Eleanor's voice from the hallway made him withdraw. "We'll continue this conversation later." As the guests gathered for dinner, Joanna retreated to the servants' quarters, her heart pounding against her ribs. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sounds of celebration, clinking glasses, boisterous laughter, and Eleanor's voice rising above it all, regaling her guests with stories of her charitable work with the local slaves. "She speaks of us like we're animals," whispered Sarah, an older woman who had served the Whitmores for over a decade. "But animals don't plot revenge." Joanna looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Sarah's weathered face was grave in the candlelight. "I've seen that look in your eyes, child. The same look I had when I first arrived. But let me tell you something. Anger without wisdom is just another form of slavery. And what would you have me do? Smile while she treats us like dirt? Pretend that this is God's will?" I'm saying be careful. The Whitmores have broken stronger spirits than yours. But as Joanna lay on her straw mattress that night, listening to the distant sounds of the feast, she felt something hardening inside her chest. The fire that had sustained her through the Middle Passage, through 3 years of degradation and abuse, was no longer just burning. It was forging something new, something dangerous. November rain drummed against the mansion's windows as Joanna scrubbed the marble floors of the main hallway, her knees raw against the cold stone. 2 weeks had passed since Thanksgiving, but the memory of that night, of Eleanor's cruel laughter and Richard's wandering hands, festered like an infected wound. "You missed a spot." Eleanor's voice cut through the morning silence. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, her emerald dress cascading around her like poisonous ivy. "Right there, by the portrait of my dear departed father-in-law." Joanna looked up at the oil painting of the elder Whitmore, his stern eyes seeming to judge her from beyond the grave. She had scrubbed that same spot 3 times already, but she dipped her brush in the bucket and began again. "You know," Eleanor continued, descending the stairs with deliberate slowness, "I've been thinking about your attitude lately. There's something defiant about you, something that needs correcting." The brush stilled in Joanna's hand. Around them, the mansion seemed to hold its breath. "I've arranged for you to spend some time with Overseer Thompson. He has such creative ways of teaching obedience." Eleanor's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Perhaps a few days in the punishment shed will remind you of your place." "Please, Mom," Joanna whispered, her voice cracking. "I've done nothing wrong." "Nothing wrong." Eleanor's laugh was like the sound of ice cracking. "You exist, girl. In my house, under my roof, eating my food. Your very presence is an affront to decent society." Eleanor knelt beside Joanna, her perfume overwhelming in its sweetness. "But don't worry, I'm going to fix you. Break you down and build you back up into something useful, something that knows its place." That afternoon, Joanna found herself in the punishment shed, a windowless wooden structure behind the main house where the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees regardless of the weather outside. Her wrists were bound to iron rings set into the wall, and her feet barely touched the dirt floor. Thompson entered with his usual swagger, rolling up his sleeves to reveal arms scarred from years of violence. "Mrs. Whitmore says you need an attitude adjustment. Lucky for you, I specialize in that particular service." The first blow caught her across the shoulders, the leather whip biting through her thin dress. Joanna bit down on her tongue to keep from crying out, tasting blood and determination in equal measure. "You people never learn," Thompson grunted, raising the whip again. "You think you're special, but you're just property. Expensive property maybe, but property all the same." Hours passed in a haze of pain and humiliation. When Thompson finally left, Joanna hung from her bonds like a broken doll, her back a map of welts and cuts. But her eyes still burned with unquenched fire. It was Sarah who found her that evening, sneaking into the shed with a bowl of water and strips of clean cloth. "Oh, child," she whispered, her hands gentle as she cleaned Joanna's wounds. "What did you do to anger her so?" "I looked her in the eye," Joanna rasped, her throat raw from suppressed screams. "I let her see that I'm not broken." "And now?" Joanna raised her head, and Sarah stepped back at what she saw there. The girl's face was swollen and bruised, but her eyes held something that made the older woman's blood run cold. "Now I understand something," Joanna said quietly. "Pain is just another language, and I'm becoming fluent." 3 days later, Joanna was released from the shed and returned to her duties. She moved through the mansion like a ghost, her face a mask of perfect submission. Eleanor watched her with satisfaction, believing she had finally broken the girl's spirit. But late at night, when the house slept and Charleston dreamed its prosperous dreams, Joanna stood at her window and planned. She studied the routines of the household, memorized the creaking floorboards and the patterns of the night watch. She observed Eleanor's habits, How she dismissed her personal maid at 10 o'clock, how she read by candlelight until nearly midnight, how she slept deeply after her nightly dose of laudanum. In the kitchen, Joanna's fingers traced the edges of the carving knives, testing their sharpness with the careful attention of a surgeon. She learned which blade held its edge longest, which handle fit most comfortably in her palm. "What are you doing, child?" Sarah's voice made her jump. Joanna turned, a paring knife still in her hand, preparing vegetables for tomorrow's soup. Sarah's eyes moved from the knife to Joanna's face, reading the truth written there. Some paths, once taken, can never be retraced. "Some cages," Joanna replied, setting down the knife with deliberate care, "can only be opened from the inside." As December approached and Charleston prepared for the Christmas season, Joanna felt the final pieces of her plan falling into place. Eleanor's cruelty had awakened something primal in her. Not just anger, but a cold, calculating fury that demanded satisfaction. The fire that had sustained her through the Middle Passage was about to become an inferno. December in Charleston brought a deceptive warmth, as if the city itself conspired to mask the coldness that dwelt within its grand mansions. The Whitmore house buzzed with preparations for the Christmas season, its halls draped in holly and evergreen, while the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg drifted from the kitchen like incense in a cathedral of commerce. Joanna moved through her duties with mechanical precision, her face a study in perfect servitude. 3 weeks had passed since her time in the punishment shed, and Eleanor had grown comfortable with what she perceived as her slave's complete submission. The mistress of the house had even begun to use Joanna as an example to the other servants. "You see how well-behaved Joanna has become," Eleanor announced during the morning staff meeting, her hand resting possessively on Joanna's shoulder. "A little correction goes a long way in teaching proper respect." Joanna kept her eyes downcast, but beneath her lowered lashes she studied Eleanor's throat, the pale column of flesh where her pulse fluttered like a trapped bird. She had been studying anatomy in the medical texts Richard kept in his study, learning about pressure points and vital organs with the dedication of a scholar. That evening, as Joanna polished silver in the dining room, she overheard a conversation that would change everything. Eleanor was entertaining Mrs. Pemberton, the wife of Charleston's most prominent judge, and their voices carried clearly through the thin walls. "I simply don't understand why you keep that particular girl," Mrs. Pemberton was saying. "She has such an unsettling quality about her." Eleanor's laugh was like crystal breaking. "Oh, Margaret, you worry too much. I've completely broken her spirit. She's quite docile now. But surely you've heard the rumors about what happened to the Ashford family's house girl last month." Joanna's hand stilled on the silver candlestick. The Ashfords lived 3 blocks away, and their slave, Mercy, had been found dead in her quarters under mysterious circumstances. "Suicide, they said," Eleanor replied dismissively. "These people are prone to such dramatics when they can't handle their circumstances." "That's just it. It wasn't suicide. My husband told me in confidence that the girl had been mutilated. Someone had cut out her tongue and left her to bleed to death." The candlestick slipped from Joanna's fingers, clattering against the table. Both women fell silent. "Joanna!" Eleanor's voice cracked like a whip. "Come here this instant." Joanna entered the parlor, her heart hammering against her ribs. Eleanor's pale eyes were sharp with suspicion. "How long have you been listening at that door?" "I wasn't listening, Ma'am. I dropped the candlestick and came to apologize." Eleanor studied her for a long moment, then smiled, her expression more terrifying than any scowl. "Of course you did. You may go." But as Joanna left the room, she heard Mrs. Pemberton whisper, "Eleanor, perhaps you should consider selling her. There's something in her eyes." "Nonsense," Eleanor replied. "I know exactly how to handle my property." That night, Joanna lay awake on her straw mattress, her mind racing. Mercy Ashford had been known for her sharp tongue and quick wit, qualities that had apparently cost her everything. The method of her murder was both brutal and symbolic. And Joanna wondered if someone else in Charleston's slave community had reached the same breaking point she was approaching. The thought should have horrified her, but instead, it filled her with a strange sense of kinship. She was not alone in her fury. Over the following days, Joanna began to notice things she had missed before, conversations that stopped when she entered a room, meaningful glances exchanged between other slaves, the way certain servants seemed to move with new purpose, as if they were part of something larger than their individual suffering. It was during Christmas Eve preparations that she finally understood. She was arranging flowers in the main hall when she overheard two kitchen maids whispering in the pantry. Another one last night, the Caldwell plantation, same as the others? Tongue cut out, left to bleed. But this time, they left a message carved into the bedpost: "Silence the silencers." Joanna's blood turned to ice. There was a pattern here, a deliberate campaign of terror targeting the cruelest masters and mistresses in Charleston. Someone, or several someones, had declared war on the system that had brutalized them for so long. That evening, as the Whitmore family attended Christmas Eve service at St. Philip's Church, Joanna found herself alone in the mansion, with only the night watchman for company. She used the opportunity to explore areas of the house that were normally forbidden to her. In Richard's study, she discovered correspondence that made her stomach turn. Letters detailing the purchase and sale of human beings, written in the same casual tone one might use to discuss livestock. But it was Eleanor's personal diary, hidden in a locked drawer, that Joanna picked with a hairpin, that revealed the true depths of her mistress's cruelty. Entry after entry detailed Eleanor's experiments in breaking the spirits of her slaves. She wrote about psychological torture with the enthusiasm of a natural philosopher, describing her methods for crushing hope and dignity with scientific precision. "The key," one entry read, "is to make them complicit in their own degradation. When they begin to hate themselves more than they hate you, you have achieved perfect control." Joanna's hands shook as she read about herself, how Eleanor had deliberately orchestrated every humiliation, every moment of pain, as part of a calculated campaign to destroy her humanity. But the final entry, dated just 3 days ago, made her blood freeze. "I believe I have pushed Joanna too far. There is something dangerous awakening in her, and I fear I may have created a monster. Perhaps it is time to arrange an accident. The river claims so many slaves during the winter months." Joanna closed the diary with trembling fingers. Eleanor wasn't just planning to continue her torment, she was planning to kill her. As the church bells of Charleston rang out across the sleeping city, announcing the birth of the Prince of Peace, Joanna made her decision. She would not wait to become another victim. She would not allow Eleanor to claim one more life in her quest for perfect control. The fire that had burned within her for 3 years was about to consume everything in its path. Christmas Day dawned grey and cold over Charleston, the harbor shrouded in mist that seemed to muffle the city's usual sounds. Inside the Whitmore mansion, the family prepared for their traditional Christmas feast, unaware that their most docile servant had spent the night planning their destruction. Joanna moved through her morning duties with the fluid grace of someone who had accepted her fate. She served breakfast with steady hands, arranged flowers with artistic precision, and responded to Eleanor's commands with perfect submission. But beneath her calm exterior, every nerve was alive with anticipation. The Christmas dinner was to be an intimate affair, just the Whitmore family and a few close friends. Eleanor had dismissed most of the staff for the holiday, leaving only Joanna and 2 other servants to manage the evening service. It was, Joanna realized, the perfect opportunity. As afternoon faded into evening, the guests began to arrive. Judge Pemberton and his wife, the merchant Caldwell and his daughter, and Dr. Morrison, Charleston's most prominent physician. They gathered in the parlor for wine and conversation, their laughter echoing through the halls like the sound of coins dropping into a collection plate. Joanna served the wine with downcast eyes, but she listened carefully to their conversation. They spoke of business and politics, of the growing tensions with the northern colonies, and of the peculiar institution that made their prosperity possible. "I tell you, gentlemen," Judge Pemberton was saying, "these recent incidents have the entire community on edge. 3 plantation owners dead in as many weeks, all killed in the same barbaric manner. Surely you don't believe it's some sort of organized rebellion?" Dr. Morrison asked, his voice tight with concern. "What else could it be? Someone is sending a message, and that message is written in blood." Eleanor's laugh was sharp and brittle. "You men worry too much. These are isolated incidents, nothing more. A few unruly slaves acting out their primitive impulses." "Perhaps," the judge replied, "but I've increased the patrols around my property. I suggest you all do the same." As the evening progressed, Joanna served course after course of the elaborate meal: roasted goose with cranberry sauce, sweet potato pudding, and Eleanor's famous syllabub. The guests ate and drank with the hearty appetite of people who had never known hunger, their faces flushed with wine and satisfaction. It was during the final course that Joanna made her move. She had prepared a special dessert for Eleanor, a delicate custard flavored with vanilla and nutmeg, but hidden within the sweet confection was a generous dose of laudanum, enough to ensure that her mistress would sleep deeply when the time came. "How thoughtful of you, Joanna," Eleanor said, accepting the dessert with a condescending smile. "You've been such a good girl lately." Joanna watched as Eleanor consumed every spoonful, her heart racing with each bite. Within an hour, the drug would take effect, and Eleanor would excuse herself to bed, claiming fatigue from the day's festivities. The plan unfolded exactly as Joanna had envisioned. By 10 o'clock, the guests had departed, and Eleanor was struggling to keep her eyes open. Richard, deep in his cups, barely noticed as his wife stumbled upstairs to their bedroom. "I'm suddenly so tired," Eleanor mumbled, her words slurring slightly. "Joanna, help me to bed." Joanna followed her mistress upstairs, her hand resting on the carving knife hidden beneath her apron. Eleanor's bedroom was a monument to excess: silk curtains, imported furniture, and a 4-poster bed that could have housed an entire slave family. "Help me with my dress," Eleanor commanded, swaying slightly as she stood before her mirror. Joanna's fingers worked the buttons and laces with practiced efficiency, all while Eleanor rambled about the evening's success. "Did you see how envious Margaret Pemberton was of my new china? And Dr. Morrison couldn't stop complimenting the meal. You did well tonight, girl." As Eleanor collapsed onto her bed, the laudanum finally claiming her consciousness, Joanna stood in the doorway and watched. Her mistress lay sprawled across the silk coverlet, her mouth slightly open, her breathing deep and regular. For a moment, Joanna hesitated. Once she crossed this threshold, there would be no going back. She would become the very monster that Charleston's elite feared, a slave who had chosen violence over submission. But then she remembered the diary entries, the casual cruelty, the systematic destruction of human dignity that Eleanor had orchestrated with such scientific precision. She thought of Mercy Ashford and the others who had died for the crime of maintaining their humanity. Joanna drew the carving knife from beneath her apron, its blade gleaming in the candlelight. The weight of it felt right in her hand, like a tool she had been born to wield. She approached the bed with the silent grace of a predator, her bare feet making no sound on the Persian carpet. Eleanor's face was peaceful in sleep, almost innocent, but Joanna knew better. She had seen the true face of this woman, the face of someone who viewed human beings as objects to be broken and discarded. The knife rose and fell with surgical precision. Eleanor's eyes snapped open for just a moment, wide with shock and terror, before the light faded from them forever. Joanna worked quickly and efficiently, her movements guided by the anatomical knowledge she had gleaned from Richard's medical texts. When it was finished, Joanna stepped back and surveyed her work. Eleanor lay still and silent, her cruel voice forever stilled. On the bedpost, Joanna carved the same message that had appeared at the other crime scenes: "Silence the silencers." As she cleaned the knife and prepared to leave, Joanna felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The fire that had burned within her for so long had finally found its purpose. She was no longer just a victim. She was an instrument of justice in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. The clock in the hallway chimed midnight as Joanna made her way back to the servants' quarters. Christmas Day was over, and Charleston would wake to discover that the war they had feared was no longer coming. It had already begun. Dawn broke over Charleston like a wound in the sky, painting the harbor waters the color of dried blood. The discovery of Eleanor Whitmore's body sent shockwaves through the colonial elite, transforming their Christmas morning from celebration to terror. Richard Whitmore's screams echoed through the mansion as he stumbled from his wife's bedroom, his face pale as parchment. "Murder! Dear God, someone has murdered my wife!" Within hours, the Whitmore estate swarmed with authorities. Judge Pemberton arrived with a contingent of constables, while Dr. Morrison examined the body with the grim efficiency of a man who had seen too much death. The message carved into the bedpost left no doubt. This was the work of the same killer who had been stalking Charleston's plantation owners. Joanna stood with the other servants in the main hall, her face a mask of shock and grief. She had practiced this expression in her small mirror, perfecting the look of a loyal slave devastated by her mistress's death. Around her, the other servants whispered prayers and dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. "This is the work of a madman," Judge Pemberton declared, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "No civilized person could commit such an atrocity." Dr. Morrison emerged from the bedroom, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hand. The killer knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was calculated, precise, almost surgical in its execution. Richard slumped in his chair, a broken man aged a decade in a single night. Who could have done this? She was beloved by everyone. Joanna bit the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing at the absurdity of that statement. Beloved. Eleanor had been feared and hated by every slave in Charleston, but the white community had seen only her charming facade. "We'll question every servant, every slave on the property," Judge Pemberton announced. "Someone saw something. Someone knows something." The interrogations began immediately. One by one, the servants were led into Richard's study and questioned by the judge and his constables. Joanna watched as Sarah was brought in first, her weathered face composed despite the circumstances. When Joanna's turn came, she entered the study with downcast eyes and trembling hands. Judge Pemberton sat behind Richard's desk like a tribunal of one, his stern face illuminated by the morning light streaming through the windows. "State your name for the record," he commanded. "Joanna, sir." "I belong to Master Whitmore. How long have you served in this household?" 3 years, sir, since I was brought from the Guinea Coast." Judge Pemberton made notes in his ledger, his pen scratching across the paper like claws on wood. "Tell me about last night. What did you observe?" Joanna recounted the evening's events with careful precision, describing the dinner service, the guests' departure, and Eleanor's retirement to bed. She spoke of helping her mistress undress and then returning to the servants' quarters, where she had slept soundly until Richard's screams woke the household. "Did you notice anything unusual about Mrs. Whitmore's behavior?" the judge asked. "She seemed tired, sir, more tired than usual. She said the evening had been a great success. And you saw nothing suspicious? No strangers on the property? No unusual sounds during the night?" "No, sir. Nothing at all." Judge Pemberton studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face for any sign of deception. But Joanna had learned to hide her thoughts behind a mask of submission, and her expression revealed nothing. "You may go," he said finally, "but you are not to leave the property without permission. None of you are." As Joanna left the study, she caught sight of Dr. Morrison speaking quietly with one of the constables. "The precision of the cuts suggests medical knowledge. We're looking for someone with anatomical training. The investigation continued throughout the day, but it yielded no concrete leads. The servants all told similar stories. They had seen nothing, heard nothing, suspected nothing. The killer had moved through the house like a ghost, leaving only death and terror in their wake. By evening, frustration was evident on every official face. Judge Pemberton gathered the household staff in the main hall, his voice heavy with authority and threat. "Someone in this house is lying," he announced. "Someone knows who committed this heinous crime, and I will not rest until the truth is revealed." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I am offering a reward of £50 for information leading to the capture of Mrs. Whitmore's killer. That's more money than most of you will see in a lifetime." Joanna felt the eyes of her fellow servants upon her, and she knew that some of them suspected the truth. Sarah, in particular, watched her with a knowing look that made her stomach clench with anxiety. That night, as the household settled into an uneasy sleep, Joanna lay on her straw mattress and planned her next move. The investigation was closing in, and she knew it was only a matter of time before someone connected her to the crime. She needed to act quickly before the net tightened around her. But she also knew that her work was far from finished. Eleanor's death was just the beginning. There were others in Charleston who deserved the same fate. The Pembertons, the Caldwells, the Morrisons, all of them had built their fortunes on the backs of enslaved people, and all of them would answer for their crimes. As the clock struck midnight, Joanna rose from her bed and moved silently through the darkened mansion. She had memorized every creaking floorboard, every squeaking hinge, and she navigated the house like a creature born to darkness. In Richard's study, she found what she was looking for, a list of Charleston's most prominent families, complete with addresses and security arrangements. Judge Pemberton had been thorough in his preparations, never suspecting that he was providing his enemy with a roadmap to revenge. Joanna studied the list by candlelight, committing every name and address to memory. Tomorrow night, she would strike again, and Charleston's elite would learn that their reign of terror was coming to an end. The hunter had become the hunted, but Joanna was no longer afraid. She was the storm that had been building for 3 centuries of oppression, and she would not be stopped until justice was served. 3 days after Eleanor Whitmore's murder, Charleston had transformed into a city under siege. Patrols roamed the streets after dark. Wealthy families barricaded themselves behind locked doors, and the slave quarters buzzed with whispered conversations that stopped whenever a white face appeared. Joanna moved through this atmosphere of fear like a ghost, her presence so unremarkable that she had become nearly invisible. The investigation had stalled, with Judge Pemberton growing increasingly frustrated as each lead evaporated into nothing. But Joanna knew her time was running short. Sarah's knowing glances had become more frequent, and she sensed that her fellow servant was wrestling with a terrible decision. On the 4th night, as a winter storm lashed Charleston with wind and rain, Joanna made her final preparations. She had chosen her next target carefully, Dr. Morrison, whose medical practice included the treatment of rebellious slaves through brutal surgical procedures designed to break their spirits. His house on Broad Street was isolated, his security minimal, and his wife was visiting relatives in Savannah. But as Joanna prepared to leave the Whitmore mansion, she found Sarah waiting for her in the kitchen, her weathered face grave in the candlelight. "I know what you've done," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible above the storm outside. Joanna's hand moved instinctively to the knife hidden beneath her cloak, but Sarah raised her hand in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to stop you, child. I'm here to warn you." "Warn me of what?" Judge Pemberton suspects. "He's been asking questions about you specifically, about your intelligence, your access to the house, your knowledge of anatomy from cleaning Richard's study." Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "He's planning to arrest you tomorrow morning." Joanna felt the walls closing in around her, but her voice remained steady. "Then I'll be gone before morning." "Where will you go?" You're a runaway slave in a city full of slave catchers. They'll hunt you down like an animal." "Then I'll die free," Joanna replied, her chin lifting with defiant pride. "Better to die fighting than to live in chains." Sarah studied her for a long moment, then reached into her apron and withdrew a small leather pouch. "There's money in here, enough to buy passage on a ship heading north, and this." She handed Joanna a folded piece of paper. "It's a letter of introduction to friends in Philadelphia, Quakers who help people like us find freedom." Joanna stared at the offerings, overwhelmed by the older woman's kindness. "Why are you helping me?" "Because I was young once and angry, and I let that anger consume me until there was nothing left but bitterness." Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. "You still have a chance to be something more than your pain. What about Dr. Morrison? What about all the others who deserve to pay for their crimes? Their judgment will come, child, but it doesn't have to come from your hand." Joanna looked out the window at the storm-lashed city, weighing her options. She could flee Charleston and seek freedom in the north, or she could stay and finish what she had started, knowing that it would likely cost her life. The decision was made for her by the sound of horses' hooves on cobblestone, barely audible above the storm. Through the kitchen window she could see torches approaching through the rain. Judge Pemberton and his constables come to arrest her under cover of darkness. "They're here," Sarah whispered, her face pale with fear. Joanna grabbed the money and letter, stuffing them into her cloak. "Tell them I ran toward the harbor. Give me as much time as you can." "Joanna." "Thank you," Joanna said, grasping the older woman's hands. "For everything." She slipped out the back door into the storm, the wind and rain immediately soaking through her cloak. Behind her, she could hear the constables pounding on the front door, their voices muffled by the weather. She had minutes, perhaps less, before they discovered her absence. Instead of heading toward the harbor, as she had told Sarah to claim, Joanna turned toward Broad Street and Dr. Morrison's house. If this was to be her last night in Charleston, she would make it count. The doctor's house was dark, except for a single candle burning in an upstairs window. Joanna circled the building, testing doors and windows, until she found one that yielded to her touch. She slipped inside, her wet feet silent on the polished floors. Dr. Morrison was in his study, slumped over his desk with an empty brandy bottle at his elbow. The storm had apparently driven him to drink, and he was snoring softly, oblivious to the danger that had entered his home. Joanna approached him slowly, the knife steady in her hand. This man had tortured countless slaves in the name of medicine, had performed procedures without anesthesia while claiming that black people felt no pain. He deserved no mercy, but as she raised the blade, something stopped her. Perhaps it was Sarah's words about becoming more than her pain, or perhaps it was the realization that killing this pathetic, drunken man would not bring back the dead or heal the wounded. Instead, Joanna set down the knife and picked up the doctor's pen. On a sheet of his personal stationery, she wrote a message in the careful script that Eleanor had unknowingly taught her. "Doctor Morrison, your crimes against my people are known. Your medical experiments on slaves who could not consent, your torture disguised as treatment, your participation in a system that treats human beings as property. I could have killed you tonight as easily as I killed Eleanor Whitmore, but I choose mercy. Use this gift wisely, change your ways, or others will finish what I have started." The voice of the voiceless. She left the letter on his desk, where he would find it upon waking, then slipped back into the storm. The constables would be searching the entire city by now, but Joanna knew Charleston's hidden places, the alleys and abandoned buildings where runaway slaves had hidden for generations. She made her way to the harbor, where ships from around the world bobbed at anchor despite the storm. Among them was a merchant vessel flying the colors of Pennsylvania, its captain known for his willingness to transport passengers without asking too many questions. Using Sarah's money, Joanna purchased passage north, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she was leaving unfinished business behind. But as the ship pulled away from Charleston's harbor in the gray light of dawn, she felt something she had not experienced in 3 years: hope. The storm was breaking, and in the distance she could see the first rays of sunlight piercing the clouds. Behind her lay a city in turmoil, its elite finally forced to confront the consequences of their cruelty. Ahead lay an uncertain future, but one where she would face it as a free woman. Joana pulled Sarah's letter from her cloak and read it by the morning light. It spoke of safe houses and underground networks, of people who had dedicated their lives to helping others escape bondage. It spoke of a different kind of resistance, one built on hope rather than hatred, on building rather than destroying. As Charleston faded into the distance, Joana made a silent promise to herself and to all those she was leaving behind. She would use her freedom wisely, would become a voice for the voiceless in ways that did not require blood. The fire that had sustained her through slavery would now fuel her fight for justice, but it would be a different kind of fire, one that illuminated rather than consumed. The girl who had arrived in Charleston as property was leaving as something far more dangerous to the system that had tried to break her. She was leaving as a free woman with a story to tell and the determination to ensure that story would be heard. In the years that followed, tales would spread throughout the South of the slave who had terrorized Charleston's elite before vanishing into legend. Some called her a monster, others a hero, but all agreed on one thing: she had proven that even the most oppressed could rise up and demand justice. And in the slave quarters of plantations from Georgia to Virginia, her story would be whispered from generation to generation, a reminder that no chain was strong enough to bind the human spirit, and no system of oppression could last forever when faced with the unbreakable will to be free. The storm had passed, but its effects would be felt for generations to come.